Welcome once again to the study of the Long Scroll, part 5. And here we are with Sophia Boothman once again, and about to engage in the study of one of the most challenging and also rewarding aspects of the Long Scroll, the dissection of a klipa, which was introduced last time in terms of substance and place and time and concept and assumptions of existence. But what makes a klipa in any of these categories? What creates the bubble of thingness that can then be applied to substantiality or dimensionality or temporality, conceptuality, or existentiality for that matter? Well, a klipa, as we know, is a reified construct. It's a compound, and it's compounded by two things: a subject, knowing, and an object, which is the klipa itself, being known. So the byproducts of this compound is that something is reified. In other words, the nature in which reality is engaged through the process of reification changes its operating system. And this goes back to what we said in part 3. If you reify reality, you treat the ground as the hyuli. You treat the ground as a reifiable proto-substance. In other words, you engage in a primordial error about the nature of reality. If you don't compound reality or a klipa in this way and set it free to be recognized in its natural state, you engage in what we call pure vision, which is an invitation into gnosis and the Gnostic understanding of reality. So a klipa, which is produced by reification, by this primordial error, is a reified construct. It is made concrete by pressure, by conceptual pressure and the pressure of designation by the mind. It's like a bubble that isolates a something, a thing to be considered by someone, right? So by virtue of the fact that this bubble is considered, there has to be somebody considering it. So it automatically implies the dualistic structure that creates all the fractures and divisions and problems and ultimately suffering associated with human habituation. Once we describe what makes a klipa, we'll then go on to talk about how klipas cluster together and form relationships. That's another consideration. But first, we have to look at the model of a klipa skin and its parts. And there are essentially 4 parts. And we have a little diagram over to the right here where all these parts are mapped out. Anytime you have a mental construct that is to be reified, it is literally like a bubble. And a bubble has essentially 2 parts being asserted: an inside and an outside. Surrounding the bubble is infinite space. In other words, everything that's not the bubble, that's a whole lot. Inside is a state of containment that's very small. Even if your bubble contains the whole of the universe and you form a bubble out of the Tzimtzum itself as a conception that includes all other conceptions, that's still extremely small, because what's outside of it is the sum total of infinity. And no matter how vast your conception of the contained portion might be, the uncontained is always way, way bigger. So a klipa makes a fundamental distinction, a dualistic distinction between containment as some state and the uncontainable. And this distinction is made at the skin of the klipa itself, the shell itself. And the shell has 2 parts that mirror this inside and outside dichotomy. There's a portion of the shell, a portion of the skin that faces in into the state of containment. And from that same point looking outward, there's a portion that faces outward towards the great unknown, the great expanse. In Kabbalah, these two aspects are termed front and back. The front faces out towards the unknowable, because that's, of course, the more vast and important aspect. So that's literally the face of what is asserted from a klipa. And its back faces into its inner registers, the contained portion. So we have an outer shell facing out and an inside layer facing in. Make sense so far?
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Hebrew letter Kaf, back of the head. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, it is, because when the Bible says no man will see the face of God and live, that's because the face of God faces outside of any contained state and is undifferentiated and is essentially facing into the mystery itself. The back of the head is just the things that can be known in a conventional sense. So the letter Kuf that you're talking about is relating to the patterns that perpetuate associative activities and forms and growth patterns. So it's a very important letter, but it's the inward facing aspect of a mystery that can't even be calculated. It also
Right.
pertains to the aspect of that process which is beyond human understanding, right? Like the unconsciousness of growth patterns, which operate in secret, in darkness, which is why the tarot card associated with it is the moon in that sense, because you're talking about the secret wisdom of things, but it's still the inward facing dynamic. And without that, we wouldn't have appearance. So it's no lesser, it's not a lesser letter because it
Right.
is actually manufacturing appearance.
Well, even in your system, the way you describe the dynamism between the sun and moon, the symbol of the moon represents appearances and what we can see, because it's cooling and congealing this dark sun, the radiant sun, into something that can be made tangible to a human being.
Right.
So,
It's the
you know,
fluidity that carries the Or Ein Sof.
right.
So I'd say that's about as good as you can get. And realization of this is wisdom itself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have the front and back of the shell. So we have two portions that we could talk about with the shell, and they each are experienced differently by conceptuality. And we'll get into that later on. Like when we engage with klipas in our lives, we have a primary reaction of hitting the shell or hitting the shell's outer aspect, and that has a certain character. And then once we get sucked in or engaged in the klipa, in other words, once we get engaged in what it appears to contain, we have a secondary reaction, and the inner shell takes us into its inner register, and we permeate that. And very often, and I'm just going to briefly mention this because we're going to talk about it later in the long scroll material. Usually when we have habits, the primary reaction we have very little say in because it happens like a lightning flash. It's instantaneous. Like we have all sorts of levels of reactivity. And the primary reactivity is too big for us to negotiate. By the time we even realize that it has happened, we're already inside. But inside, there is a certain amount that we could do, right? Like first we have the reaction and we just have to bear it. Once we're inside of it, we could start transmuting it. That we always transmute from the inside out. That's why we invite the scorpion to sting us with its poison again and again and again, so we could take it into ourselves and actually work with it. So we have the front and back, inner and outer aspect of the shell, the bubble, so to speak. But then we have two other parts that we have to contend with. Inside of each klipa construct is a concealed spark of divinity, the hidden spark. But what makes it hidden? The fact that there's a shell. in front of it, right? If you take away the shell, it's not hidden anymore. And if it's not hidden anymore, it can't even really be a spark, because if you think about it, it's a spark of the Or Ein Sof. Does that imply that you could break the Or Ein Sof into little pieces and hide them? No, that's ridiculous. The Or Ein Sof is wholeness itself. So there is no such thing as sparks. If you have one spark, you have the whole of infinity. If it's either it is Or Ein Sof or it isn't. If you treat it as a spark, you're treating it as an ordinary object. It's only the hiding of it with the shell that makes it seem that way. So the shell is actually responsible for how we fragment bits of reality into moments in time and locations in space and individual concepts and individual things. So the shell is a thing-making, fragmentary, divisive system. And its job is simply to conceal the bright, open luminosity of wholeness itself. So we say that there is a spark concealed in the klipa, but that is a lie. It only appears that way. And when it's uncovered, we see the error of what we believed about reality, which is that it can be divided up into unrelated pieces. Unity is the lack of peacemaking, individual pieces, and is the medicine for the disease of fragmentation in that sense. Okay, now we're down to the fourth part of the construction of a klipa, which in my opinion is tremendously important and never talked about by anyone. If we have a portion of the shell that faces in to the containment of its state where sparks are concealed, and we have a portion of the shell that goes from that point outward facing into infinity, these are artificially divided directions that are superimposed by concepts, because it's just a shell. It's not two shells. It's one shell, but you could talk about its aspect facing in and its aspect facing out. If we are conceptually designating these directional vectors, then we could conceptually also designate a place where they touch. Where is the place where inner and outer touch each other? Well, this is a place that can never be found, because you can't mechanically reduce the appearances of reality to these shells, because the shells weren't real to begin with. So when you're dealing with a shell that is seemingly apparently real, knowing that its reality is highly questionable, you could look at these distinctions between inner and outer that your mind is making, and you could say, ah, somewhere in there is the touch point, the secret mystery touch point, which is beyond inner and outer. And it's right where inner and outer assert themselves. This point I refer to as the black ether, the point of nothingness, fullness that is inherent within everything, but can only be found once you question the inner and outer relationships that seem to make things so real. This is where the open fullness of the Or Ein Sof can literally be found, right in the shells of the klipas, right in the very shells that torture you in your life in making conceptual divisions between things, grasping after things in places, in times, to conceptualize about and designate and structure and plan your entire life. What do you like? What do you not like? What are you running from? What are you running towards? The sum total of all of it is just asserting the skins of a million klipas that are like bubbles in an infinite foam. And right there at any single point within that foam, you can find liberation. And any single point, you could find the point where inner and outer touch. And that's where you can not only unmake the shell, but can release the contained spark into the fullness of its wholeness. And in that releasing, the spark which remember is a lie, and the black ether that unmakes the shell are realized as one and the same. Wholeness is absolute. Fragmentation is relative. Fragmentation, or the habit of fragmentation, is a relative habit that can be unmade anywhere the black ether is discovered. Make sense, Sophia?
So why is it that the black ether is found in this in-between place at the point where inner and outer touch?
Because the place where inner and outer touch is not real to begin with. It's an assumption. It's a conceptual assumption that you are making because of your habits. You are making this assumption because of your habits without ever having chosen to do that. It's a primordial habit. It's the habit of the Hyuli. It's the habit of believing that reality is substantial and real, and that your reification is well-founded. We just show up in the human realm with this assumption, and it's never challenged. So what happens when you treat reality this way? Well, you're going to assert inner and outer relationships everywhere you go. In other words, you're going to manufacture klipas out of everything you do and every nuance and detail of your life.
Okay, so it sounds like it exists there in this symbol system because that's what happens when you're forced to reckon with the fact that this ultimate paradox exists, that the inner and outer appear to be real, but neither one is. And so seeing them together as two sides of this reified coin that are both incorrect, that's why the black ether is in the middle there, because you have to understand, you have to unmake both inner and outer at once.
Well, this is why we say to reality, come get us. We say to the Corpian, sting me, give me your poison. And we contend with the foam of a million klipas, right? We don't run from this scenario. We plunge ourselves into this scenario so that we could face the mistake that we're making and unmake it by our own effort. That if you think that containment and the uncontainable are different, if you are holding that view, immerse yourself in that view and challenge it. And there in that challenge, you will find the potential for the black ether. And in the black ether comes not the liberation of a spark, but the liberation of all sparks. Because ultimately, the black ether touches upon the klipa skin of whatever you're doing, but also touches on the klipa skins of every other conceptual designation in your life and every other so-called concealed spark in the reality field that you are engaged in. So you think mechanically, I'm liberating one klipa and taking the spark out of that klipa. No, you're liberating all klipa skins and liberating all sparks if you do it profoundly. The difference is that if you have this moment of pure vision that arises by virtue of the fact that you're transmuting the poison of reification into the nectar of pure view, that instance of liberation can be like a lightning flash and then over. Then you fall back into habit. The problem is the stickiness of our habits, because you're going to do the same thing again and again and again and again and again. That's the momentum. So that's why we call it practice.
That's the Rishimu.
Yeah, that's the stickiness of the Rishimu. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the stickiness of the Rishimu is sticky because it wants to bind itself to what it was doing before. It wants to regain its momentum again and again and again. So if we challenge it and even make a success, it's not permanent. We'll just fall back into the habits until we practice deeper and deeper over and over and over. And the momentum of our practice begins to offset the momentum of our habituation. And we challenge the stickiness of the Rishimu, and we stop treating the ground as Hyuli and treat it as a Vira.
Brilliant. Yeah, this is wonderful. So this unmaking the klipas is practice per se. That's what we're doing when we practice. We're releasing this black ether, or releasing the sparks rather.
Best case scenario, yeah.
Yeah.
Realizing the black ether is very elusive, and you could fool yourself into thinking that you're doing it. And there's all kinds of claims that people make for themselves in their own mind due to their own fantasies of themselves as practitioners. And one of them is that I am holding a view and I'm seeing reality as pure. Now, how do you know that you're not wrong? How do you know that you're not making a mistake? Well, it comes, it's a tough test, because ultimately the test of whether you've done this or not is based on your own level of attachment and ultimately suffering. If you are suffering through the existentiality of what is transpiring in the reality field, then you haven't done it, right? Because ultimately the black ether is the medicine for suffering itself and attachment itself. And most of us will think we've had a moment of success, and maybe we have, but the descent back into habit is so fast and so powerful that we won't be able to distinguish the moment of success itself from the descent back into failure, Gnostic failure. And the goal is to not try to calibrate how well you've done. That's not the goal. You're not achieving some tangible byproduct of a goal that can be mechanically reduced from your situation. The goal is to just strive constantly to live a life of the love of the infinite and not worry about the repercussions. You always practice as deeply as possible, assuming that there is more to do. You never assume accomplishment. You always go further. You always encounter reality as if it were a set of klipas that could be further liberated into the brilliance of the natural effulgent state of the Avira at all times. Even in your stable enlightenment, if you achieve such a thing, you approach reality as a practitioner, as if there were more to do. That's the mentality. The mentality is just simply love of the divine, which goes on and on forever and is open. So if it closes up, there's more opening to be accomplished. So fixating on our goals and accomplishments is just a losing battle, because then you make a klipa out of it, period.
Yeah. I guess what a better way to phrase that is that when we practice, we are attempting to unmake these klipas. And I'm also reminded of previous conversations we've had where we've designated love, not this psychological emotional state, but this love and striving for the divine as both the goal and the practice and the solvent that unmakes opaque reality and allows it to become transparent, right? That's synonymous with releasing the spark and allowing the black ether to melt these klipa shells.
Well, in the words of Plato, what we're talking about here is the good, the true, and the beautiful. You're talking about true beauty, true goodness, and truth itself, right? That is the love. The love that we're talking about is the annihilation of the lover and the thing that is loved. Ultimately, both drown in the opening state of falling. That's why we call it falling in love. It's literally falling. It's literally a free fall, right? It's engaging in an ecstatic free fall of joy. And really, there is no end. There is no end. Sof. It is Ein Sof. Ein Sof is this love.
Yeah, and the lover metaphor made such sense to me because if you consider it at a gross level, what do you want to do with your lover? You want to unite, you want to erase barriers between the lover and the beloved until neither one really exists. It's all just love and the divine. And that's why the metaphor makes sense, is we're erasing these barriers, we're erasing any distinction between a this and a that.
Plus, this scenario can occur anytime, anywhere, and anything, right? Like, for example, I love pizza, right? So does that mean that I shouldn't, that I'm doing something wrong? No, because if I hold my view correctly, my love of pizza can be love of the divine. It can
Yeah.
be. Or it could descend in the grasping of, oh, I want my slice. I want my pizza. I'm enjoying. I want another one. I want another. So it's a very subtle distinction because it's the same activity, right? That
Yeah.
I could love pizza either conventionally or by holding the view that I'm talking about. And who will ever know? Only I will know, and I might not even know. I might fool
Yeah.
myself. I might fool myself
Right.
sitting there in my car eating a slice of pizza and thinking to myself, wow, my practice is really going well this morning.
Yeah, I'm not grasping anything.
Right. And the reality of it is that the attitude for a practitioner is you should always consider your practice a work in progress. There's always more to go. You should always immerse yourself as if you're diving off the high board into nowhere, right? That it's always at the cusp of beginning, right? Like Rebbe Nachman has this great saying. He says that, essentially a true practitioner should say to themselves at any level, today I'm going to start for real. At this moment, I'm going to start for real. As if everything I've done up to this point, well, that was whatever. But right now, I'm going to really start. You're always at that point of beginning. And that
Mhm.
has a magic to it that can't be grasped. That is literally connected to the black ether, that point of continual beginningness, because you can't reify it. If it's always beginning, what is there to be reified? Right? It's atemporal in the extreme. And temporality is a particular quality out of those 5 qualities that relates to the ruach. The ruach moves, and movement is calibrated as time. So when you unmake time, you unmake a whole lot of other things in the associative chain. And when you witness the associative patterns of people, they're always time based. They're fast, they're slow, they move in different patterns in different ways. If you unmake time, you can see them as residue traces, you could say. So pretty much what we're talking about here encapsulates what you do with this view that I've been talking about. What you do with the view is you enter into the field of Klipos directly. You face it. You don't run away from it. And you do your work there, allowing the scorpion to sting you over and over and over. And you accept the toxicity of its poison and you transmute it by learning a view that is utterly and completely different from what you're doing conventionally, giving reality an entirely new meaning. Any statements, Miss Sophia, Miss Wisdom?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just trying to absorb all of this, take this all in. It doesn't matter how many times we talk about these things. I always feel like I have to give it space to kind of soak in.
That's right.
I guess that's me transmuting the scorpion sting, right? Yeah, every single time. So
Well, we pretty much covered the
yeah.
material on this section of the long scroll. And this is part 5, 3, 4, 5. Yes, 5. And I will sign off now and greet my audience once again with part 6 at a future time. Thank you for bearing with me in the study of the long scroll.
Thank you, Dave.